Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the co-writer and artist of the upcoming The Umbrella Academy Plan B over at Dark Horse Comics. It's Gabriel Bá. Thanks for coming on, Gabriel.
Thank you for having me, David.
So we are recording this on Thursday, May 29th. It's about to be a big stretch for you. You got your first, it seems like the first big work in comics for you, at least published in America in 6 years or so. How's everything for you?
It's been fine. My life has been quite, I would say, far from comics for a while because I'm not on the mainstream monthly schedule so much anymore. So things are quieter, but, I'm always working slowly now, slower.
Yeah.
But it's great to be so close to release something again, I think.
Do you still kind of anticipate releases at all? Is that something you still feel, or is that kind of a little bit more muted than it was when you were earlier in your career?
Oh, it's different now. I'm not, I'm not as anxious as I used to be. Things were more. mm, I know how things work now, and I don't get stressed with early reactions or the anticipation of a new release, or because since I work on long projects, I know the whole impact will be at the end of the run. So, even though I'm excited to be releasing a new Umbrella Academy comic, I'm not as anxious or nervous as I used to be.
I imagine a lot of that kind of comes from the experience of having done this so many times and like having worked in different formats and everything where certain books, like I've been re-looking through details or however you pronounce that precisely. And I've been going through that and going through some other books. And like you've done a lot of stuff in single issues. You've done stuff kind of as, ultimately something that was collected as a graphic novel. And so experience probably cuts down on a lot of that stuff because you kind of, what's coming your way, and you're not really, that people are not really going to have a full sense of everything until like Plan B is over, really.
Yeah. Even though like Umbrella Academy fans specifically, they are very engaged with the story and with the comic. So everything is a little bit heightened up with this comic, and I'm used to it now. So I'm glad it's coming because it's good to give the readers something new, something they want and they've been waiting for, and it will be a nice experience to see how this monthly thing is working now, because I think the monthly market changed over the years,
Yeah.
over the last few years, and I've been so far away, I don't really know how it is now, and it will be a good way to measure that. So, fingers crossed.
Yeah. Well, you said you've been outside of like the monthly beat. You've been kind of outside that rotation and everything. And you also said you've been working. I mean, that's the thing that's always interesting, I think, for anybody who's in a creative profession, is that people think that when things aren't being released, that maybe like the work just isn't happening. And I'm sure you've been busy for the entire time. And you had some smaller releases in there. I know you did the Casanova story in the Image 30th anniversary anthology that they did. And then there was a story you and Fabio did for, your twin Fabio Moon did for I Hate Fairyland on Scotty Young's Substack. So there have been some small things in there, but what have the past few years been like for you?
Well, two major things happened that changed my work routine, I would say. One, I had kids, so now I have two kids, and I didn't have before. So, I have a 6-year-old daughter and a 3-year-old son. And right, at the same time, the pandemics happened, and that also changed, a lot of the way my brother and I worked at the studio, and the speed that we could work on, how many hours we could spend working, and also like our contact with the comics world or even the outside world at all. Like during the pandemics, like everything was on a second round, on the background, and we were just trying to figure out how to stay alive or survive this crazy times we were going through, here in Brazil and across the world, I imagine. So, you know, all this happened at the same time, put a lot of things in different perspectives, different priorities, but I never stopped working. We began working on Plan B in the first months of 2020.
Yeah.
So we've been working on this for 5 years. And so, on a very slow pace, everything is written. We wrote the whole thing before I started drawing because we wanted to have the whole story, make sure we had the whole story because Gerard also got back touring with the band. So we didn't know, how his schedule would be. It's funny that when we did Apocalypse Suite and Dallas, he was on tour, I think for Black Parade, but it's a completely different world now. And, everyone is in a different place in their lives. So it's not the same thing. We don't have the same time to put on and to dedicate to this comic. So we had to just use the time that we had and try to, get the best out of it. So, but yeah, you're right when you say that, readers, they they only see what's coming out,
Yeah.
and that's the good thing about monthly comics is that you have something new every month. But since I work on graphic novels as well, and collections of short stories, I'm used to be uh, away for a long time before I release something new. It's just a matter of dealing with the anxiety and the pressure, and to know that that doesn't really matter. What matters is to do a good work, and the best work that you can do, and it takes time. That's how I feel about it.
Do you feel like that stretch where, you had kids and you went through the pandemic? And I mean, one of the things that's like, we always talk about the isolation involving the pandemic, and like there's the isolation that people would feel individually, but also you're in Brazil, like you're way separate from the world that you kind of work in, which is quite often like kind of the American comic industry. And so you have that added layer of isolation. Do you feel like that stretch has changed you at all as like a creator, or maybe the types of stories you might be interested in telling going forward?
I think so. Pandemics put a lot of things into a new perspective, and I think it did change the ways I view some things, and the ways I relate to work and to the stories I want to tell. But to be honest, like I was already working on two projects when the pandemics hit, and every new idea or everything that I learned with it are going on projects that are not yet started, so they're, being processed and being locked into special places for future stories, I would say. But I think one thing that really changed was the traveling factor on my life for all these reasons, the pandemics and having kids, staying at home more, or how important it is to be at a convention just to, you know, sit on a table or to give a panel or to sell some like commissions or stuff. And or even to remind people that you exist, because that's one important part of going to conventions is to remind the readers, look, I'm here. But I just don't care that much about that anymore, because I've done that for a long time, and people don't realize how far Brazil is. And but my brother and I, we did that for a long time, every year, and that's part of how we built our career in the US. But now I think that's built, and I just want to focus on the work, and only travel when it will really make a difference, my presence being there, like a book release, or if it's really important. And so that, I think that definitely changed the way I look at it now after the pandemics.
Yeah. I mean, your circumstances have changed, so your priorities changed alongside it. It makes sense. That was one of the things I thought was interesting, though, is when I was doing research for this, one thing that came up quite a bit was that you and Fabio, when you were, you started off making zines and you're self-publishing your own comics like in the early 90s and everything, but it seems like one of the ways that you really tried to make inroads in the American comic industry was in particular attending San Diego Comic-Con over and over.
Yeah.
Was that it seems like San Diego Comic-Con was a really big focus for you on like, how do we make this work? How do we build these relationships we need? Was that a big part of your journey coming up?
I think so. I think the whole convention scene in the US has changed over the years, but I still believe San Diego is the only convention where you can find a little bit of every corner of the comics market in the US. So you have independent creators self-publishing and selling their comics in the small press area or something. You have small publishers, medium publishers, alternative publishers, mainstream publishers, a lot of artists that go to promote their books. So there are a lot of other conventions in the US. One's more mainstream, one's more indie, but the one that you can find maybe everyone or a lot of people, I think it still is San Diego.
Yeah.
And that 30 years ago, that was even more so. And for us living in Brazil, we only had like one chance to do that. So we couldn't do like a tour of conventions. And we didn't even have material to show or to sell in the early years. So we started coming to San Diego in 97 to trying to find a publisher for Roland, a series that we were working on at the time, medieval series. And then we started, getting to know publishers, editors, some artists, and we would return every year uh, to show, whatever we were working on in Brazil, show new stuff. We spent 3 years on this Roland miniseries, trying to find a publisher, then deciding to self-publish, and then having a table to sell the comics there. And it took us something like 6 years, I think, to get something published, to get a short story on an anthology, or 1 year before that, it was the first time we got some interest, some response from Diana Schultz at Dark Horse. We talked to her like a couple of times in San Diego on like panels. She was with Frank Miller because she was his editor at the time. So she was always with him on panels, and we loved Frank's work. So we were always on his panels. So we talked to her a few times, and at a certain point, we sent her by mail some stories that we wrote, some comics that we did here in Brazil, translated, and she liked it. So that was like around 2002 or something. So it was only on 2003 that we got our first short story published on an anthology at Dark Horse. And then, one story published on another publisher that got us in touch with Matt Fraction, that got us in touch, in trains to do Casanova. And, that led to Umbrella. And, one thing led to the other. So it took us like 10 years. In 10 years, we got to Umbrella Academy.
Yeah.
I guess. So, and 2 years before that, we got short stories on anthologies, one book published by a small publisher, and Casanova at Image, this kind of stuff. But that was going every year to San Diego, and then coming back, working on new stuff, getting in touch, and returning the next year with new stuff. We couldn't invest more time than we had, we tried to get submission pages for publishers that would have monthly work, but it sucked. We always did a lousy job trying to draw pages out of thin air or out of scripts that we didn't like, stories that we didn't believe in. So we were not really made for work for hire kind of stuff. There are great artists who can just do that, and we can't. We need to like the story, get excited about it, and that will reflect on the artwork. So it worked on Casanova, even though Casanova is a very difficult comic, and it was in the early issues, it was even more difficult because Matt was also, getting to learn how to write what he wanted, and but we like the story, really like the story, and it's very exciting. And Umbrella Academy just clicked when I met Gerard and saw the first scripts. It just worked, thankfully.
Yeah. I did want to bring up, this is in regards to something that you were just talking about. There is the intro to Details is from Dinah Schutz, and in it there's a line that she said that I thought was really fascinating. She said they handed me a copy. This was at San Diego Comic-Con. They handed me a copy of their first U.S. published work, an action adventure tale they'd drawn in their early 20s when they still believed in superheroes. And I thought that was a really interesting line from her because, I don't know, it kind of implies that there was a moment where you could have went in a different direction. Was there a time where you might have visualized a different path for yourself as a comic artist, both you and Fabio, I guess?
I think it's just a matter of, it's something that most artists will go through. And it really depends on where do you live and what's available for you to read, to discover. So for a long time, we grew up reading superheroes in the 80s. Very exciting times. It was awesome. We were very excited. We were, kids, but it was awesome. And if you would go to the comic stands here in Brazil, you would only get superheroes from the US. That's not true. You would get European comics and some Brazilian comics as well, but that was every month. The monthly thing, the thing that you can count on. So every month, new material, and because it's a machine, and so there was a time we figured out that if we wanted to work in comics, that's the thing that we had to do. We didn't think we could do anything else. That's the biggest change that had in our mindset when we first went to San Diego in 97, because we saw that even in the US market, there was all sorts of comics and styles and genres and everyone doing their own stuff. So that really freed us from this kind of haunted mentality of if you want to work in comics, you gotta draw superheroes. And because the stories that we liked were, day by day, ordinary, regular life kind of stuff. Stories that we would find in books or we would find in movies, but we didn't really find as many in comics. And we thought we could do that. And, at that time, we really figured like, oh, it is possible. So it really didn't matter how long it would take. This notion of this possibility was just the spark that we needed to keep, looking for a way to tell these stories. And I think that's the change that Diana saw, like from the comic book that we sent her, it's the medieval story. But it was a kind of medieval story, but drawn. The artwork was mostly based on the comic books that we were reading at the time, and it was mainly superheroes. The more medieval stuff that we used to get access to was Conan the Barbarian, or early, some issues of Prince Valiant, maybe. And at the same time, Frank Miller was releasing 300. So we figured like, oh, we're doing the right thing, historical fiction, and this is going to be a big hit. It didn't become a big hit, but it was really important for our career growing up. But, everything changed once we started writing stories about, relationships and work and day by day kind of stuff.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. Love sci-fi, horror, fantasy, and action? Then 2000 AD is the greatest comic you're not reading. 2000 AD has a whole universe of characters from Judge Dredd and Strontium Dog through to Rogue Trooper, Zenith, Shakara, and many more. In every weekly issue, you get 5 action-packed stories from incredible creators including Garth Ennis, Rob Williams, Alex DeCampi, and Dan Abnett. Get a print subscription and it'll arrive at your door every week, and your first issue is free. Or subscribe digitally, get free back issues, and download DRM free copies of each issue for just $9 a month. That's 128 pages of incredible comics every month for less than $10. And all subscribers get amazing offers like money off vouchers and exclusive products. Head to 2000AD.com and click on subscribe now, or download the 2000AD app and start reading today. And now, back to the show. I mean, everything you're talking about kind of fits into something that I think is really interesting about your career, where besides, I guess, I kind of count that I Hate Fairyland story to some degree, but then also you did BPRD 1947 and Vampire, which were both for hire projects. Obviously, that's a big deal for you. I know you're a big Mignola fan. I know that it was important for yourself figuring out your own voice as an artist and everything like that. But it always has felt like the two of you have kind of wanted to make your own mark. You didn't want to just follow. You wanted to do your own thing. And you can see that in everything you do, like Day Tripper, obviously, in even Umbrella Academy, absolutely. You can see that in Casanova, the stuff that you're doing with Matt there. It can go on and on. But I am curious, one of the things that kind of brings all these things together is it kind of feels like one of the things that attracts you to projects is things that push you and your talents in new directions. Is that something that appeals to you as a creator, as wanting to how do I open new paths up for myself as a storyteller, whether that's the story you're telling or the approach you have on it?
I think so. Yeah. The challenge is very important. We're not, and you will notice that I say we a lot because it's Fabio and I, because we have the same approach, even though we don't work in every project together, but we're not the kind of artists who want to work at the same thing for forever. We don't really do a lot of character-based stories because of that. Because, the story drives everything else. So You know, even though we know how we know the appeal and the force of a character driven story, because we worked on Umbrella Academy, we worked on Casanova, and we worked on BPRD, so we know that has a lot of appeal, but that's not what we love to do. We love to create new stories that will bring new challenges and will force us to create characters to tell those stories. And because not every character can live every story, and the different this unknown different aspect of a new story is what drives us. So um, like working on Umbrella Academy was a way of fulfilling that teenager dream of working with superheroes.
Hmm.
I can put everything that I you know drank upon as a teenager into these comics, and be it just visually or in the themes of the story and the way we approach it. um, because I now I understand and respect the genre of the superhero stories, and we can put another layer into it, the same way we did with Casanova in this whole sci-fi spy genre. uh, and Matt does it really well, and we just love Mignola and everything that he did, and we respect Hellboy a lot, and that's the reason we said yes to working on BPRD, because it was in the past and didn't have Hellboy, so we could work in the Hellboy universe and and play with that, but we wouldn't ruin Hellboy by you know working specifically with him.
Hmm.
But we did eventually. We did have a couple of stories with him that Mike wrote for Hellboy Mexico, I think. But yeah, the challenge is the fuel for sure, because there should be more and not always the same, always the same. And but it's strange, but it's in a sense we don't know what it is until it is, until it begins, it exists. And that was one of the biggest challenges of pitching Day Tripper, because as an idea it was very hard to say what it would be, but we knew, but it was very hard to sell.
I was rereading some of that for this, and I did not realize that Pornsak Pisha showed actually was one of the editors on the book. It's funny to see
Yeah.
like how much things have changed, but you're talking about the unknown. That's the thing is like you can't really know what you're looking for until you find it, because otherwise it wouldn't be the unknown. And tying into Plan B really quick for Umbrella Academy Plan B, one of the big differences with that is you're drawing it as per usual, but you're also co-writing it. And you've written stuff before. I'm not trying to act like you haven't. You've even co-written because you do stuff with Fabio, but doing it with somebody else that you haven't known for literally your entire life, that probably changes things a bit. Does that kind of appeal for the same reasons, because you're kind of doing the unknown of something you've never done before in that very specific way?
I don't know. I think with Umbrella and my work relation with Gerard, it's a little bit different, because we started this thing almost 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And since then, we got to know each other a lot more. We spent a lot of time together, talked about a lot of stuff, not only Umbrella, And and for this story, I think maybe a little bit because of the TV series, we had a lot of talks about the whole story, future chapters, what was going to happen, the roles of the characters and stuff. So when I first started this project, I was in the dark, and he was leading the way because he had the whole story. But now we know where we're going, both of us. And when you start something from scratch, you don't know, you have a lot of ideas, but once you begin building it, it gets a it's kind of like it gets a life of its own, voice of its own. And some ideas work, some ideas don't work anymore because they don't fit into what you're building anymore. So in a sense, given that we already have 3 books published, we have that the Science miniseries, we have some short stories. Uh, this comic book has its own personality, has its own vibe, and we both know what it is. We know what works, what doesn't work, and we know what we want to tell, and we kind of know how to tell it. But now it's a matter of sitting down and doing it. And I figured, we both figured that I could help writing the comic book now, because I I'm too deep into it now, and I used to. And in early arcs, maybe I used to give opinions on the storytelling aspect of it, sometimes splitting up a panel or merging 2 panels, or you know saying what I thought would work better in the layouts, or designing characters or the places, or stuff like that. But I think back on Hotel Oblivion, I started saying 1 or 2 things about some details that worked better or didn't work. And yeah, and after that, we both had a mutual feeling that we could just do it together, like write it together, pitch in, both pitching in ideas on how to tell the story, what how to, because the ideas are already there, uh, until the end of what we think it's the end of the story. So just a matter of writing it.
I mean, you've been working together for so long. I imagine you two know each other and your strengths and how to best work together and what appeals to you as storytellers really well. I mean, one other thing that's interesting, I think, is that I'm trying to think of the writers you've worked with. There's not a lot of writers you've worked with that weren't artists, but Gerard, I think something that people sleep on is he studied at the School of Visual Arts, and he actually has an artistic background. Do you feel like that collaboration is one that's, I don't know, do you think his artistic background and the fact that you have experience as a writer kind of aids you to speaking the same language and getting Umbrella Academy to the place it needs to be?
I think Gerard definitely has maybe the attitude of someone who would write and draw you know his own story,
Sure.
if he could. So it's always, you can tell when reading a script, the script of someone who would draw it, and the script of someone who's just writing it. You know, writing is not an easy task, by no means, by any means, but you can tell when it's a writer's script and when it's maybe a cartoonist script, because it's different. The visual cues are better, and the rhythm of the story, the pace of the story is different. And there were always a lot of great visual insights and tips and details on Gerard's script from the beginning that always helped building this world of the Umbrella Academy. And I don't know if it's just that, but we are, you know, the same age, so the same generation. We grew up reading the same comics, and so I knew where he was coming from when, you know, he was writing the visual ideas that he had in his mind. That really helped as well. Um, but I think that the fact that he can draw and he knows what he wants visually made the initial scripts more, maybe more pleasant and easier to dive into for me. And that helps, you know, even now when we're discussing the new ideas and the new images that we want to tell, it's easy to, you know, come across, to get that across from each other.
You said that the scripts for like a writer versus a cartoonist are different in this in like the way it's approached. I'm curious as to like what is an example of that? Like how do they differ? Like would you is it more in reference to like how you would write for yourself versus like how you would write to somebody else, or is it something else?
It's something else. I don't know. It's, well, if you look at, for example, the, for example, 9 panel grid pages. 9 panel grid pages, they force the artwork or the page into a rhythm of 9 panels that have the same size. So you already take away one of the elements that the artwork can express time or importance into the narrative. And writers love grids because they can control the rhythm of the narrative in a way. And that kind of limits the artist into those grids. And not every artist and not every story work well on a grid. So, and you know, I think it's both Alan Moore's fault and also Frank Miller, because the Dark Knight Returns is it's actually like 4 by 4. But you know, Alan Moore is a writer's writer, and he writes everything that he wants in a panel. I've heard, and you know that it's informative for the artist, but at the same time, kind of limiting. And you know, working on a grid is not the dream for me, at least. And you know, sometimes you can see one story that happens only on the dialogues. The dialogues are very important. For example, Sandman, you know. So Neil is a writer, and his magic is on the words, the way he writes, the way the characters speak, the way he narrates. The artwork doesn't really matter. And Sandman is a great proof of that, because he had different artists and it didn't really change the matter of the story. The story is in the words. And so so you can see on, you know, the way a story is told, and you can see it already on the scripts when it's a writer that wrote it, or if it's a cartoonist that gives the artwork room to also tell the story. So you will have more silent moments and bigger panels, and you know, it's more dynamic visually. So I think a good collaboration in that sense is 100 Bullets, because Brian is a great writer, and he's a writer, but he doesn't really limit the artists. He doesn't impose like grids or stuff like that. But his story is in the dialogues that he writes. Great. But on the other hand, Eduardo is awesome. And what he brings to the story is not on the script. The way he chooses how to lay out the page or how to put on the camera, and he brings that to the story. And that's a great collaboration, I think, of writer, and artist. Because Eduardo also doesn't really want to write. He's just an artist. He's an awesome artist.
He's a great artist.
Yeah, but he doesn't have that, urge to tell stories or stuff.
He was big for you, right? Coming up when you were figuring out your voice?
Yeah, when I discovered his work, it was like later than all of the other stuff because he didn't work in superheroes. So when I discovered his work was in 100 Bullets, then I went after things that he's done before that. And yeah, and especially given that he's from Argentina, that it's nearby, but I didn't know anything at all about Argentinian comics, and I discovered everything that I know now because of him. I looked after, and I went to his show. He runs a show there, and most importantly, I think Eduardo is like an amazing role model for a disciplined artist that has a work routine, has his priorities in place, and he's a family guy. He has 3 kids. There are 3 men now. But when I met him, they were kids, and he works only on daylight, goes home for lunch, take a siesta after lunch, go back, work, and go back home. Doesn't work on weekends. So he's not the usual slave of work artist that we know, that we think that that's the only way to make it. And he did work a lot. He worked a lot in the Argentinian market. After that, he went to work to the Italian market, where he had to draw like 3 times more pages than he had when he first went to work for the US market. So the US market for him was easier because he had to draw less than he used to drawing for the Italian market. And so he did his dues to get to fulfill his dream of working in comics as well and paying the bills.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. In store this June, Oni Press proudly presents a science fiction icon's unlikely return to existence in Benjamin #1, a new prestige format limited series from Philip K. Dick Award winner Ben H. Winters and artist Leo Max. Do you remember the work of acclaimed novelist Benjamin J. Karp? Across more than 44 novels and hundreds of short stories, Karp established himself as a counterculture revolutionary. He died in 1982 after years of Southern Californian excess finally claimed his life, until 2025, when Benjamin Karp awakens alive in a burned-out motel room on the fringes of Los Angeles. He remembers dying. He knows he shouldn't exist. Now, as he treks from Studio City to Venice Beach and onward into the paranoid sprawl of 21st century Los Angeles, he'll be called to investigate his greatest mystery yet, himself. Explore the metatextual nexus between existence and oblivion, past and future, genius and madness this June in Benjamin #1, only from Oni Press. And now, back to the show. Well, I mean, I think that's one of the things that, you're coming from Brazil, he's coming from Argentina. And so you have to, find the work where it is and kind of like break into the markets as you can. I do think that's one of the things that's really amazing is just like how robust the artists and cartoonists from both of those countries have become, really. And like, I think a lot of people don't even realize like who's from there and who's doing stuff. Like one of my favorite, I love Julian Totino Tedesco, and he's an Argentinian. Mm-hmm. I was actually just thinking about it. I was like, I don't know if you ever read this, but there was a comic a few years ago called the Terrible Elizabeth Dumb against the Devils in Suits, and it's Arabson, who is a Brazilian artist. And like, I don't think a lot of people realize just how kind of robust those, the kind of comic scene and comic creators are from both of those countries. But one thing I didn't realize before I started researching this, and I don't know how I didn't, is the core divide between you and Fabio in terms of how you approach art. You ink with a pen and he inks with a brush. And as soon as I read that, I was like, how did I never notice that? It completely stands out. It's such a fascinating thing. was that like something? Was that something you two did strictly because that's the style that spoke to you, or was there a part of? Did you have a conversation about like how do we differentiate ourselves to some degree?
No, that was like a discovery. And I specifically for me, I started inking with pens when I discovered that Mignola did it. Because at that point, we thought, because we didn't have a lot of contact with creators in Brazil or even in the US. So the first time I went to San Diego, I went to Mike's table and saw some originals, and he was drawing with his pens, and and he said he inked with that, and that also like liberated me from trying to get what I wanted out of a brush, because in my mind, professional artists would ink with brush because that was what we thought and what we had contact with, like the inking art style of the early 90s was like, let's call it the image style, right? Jim Lee and this kind of stuff. And that kind of inking was done with like brushes and maybe pen nibs, but we were we were taught here in Brazil by agents or professional artists that were starting to break through into the US market that you have to ink with a brush. So we figured like that's how it's done. And once I realized the artist that I liked inked with a pen,
It's
that
over.
was it.
It's over.
Yeah, it was over. And Fabio always liked Will Eisner a little bit more, and Jeff Smith. And so this kind of influence, and after that, Pope. So all these artists were brush kind of artists. So his art style went that direction, and my art style went to the other direction. And but you that's the beauty of art in general. Like when you look at it, you don't really need to see how it's done. You just need to see it, right? So when you're reading a comic book, if you're paying attention on the inking or how it's drawn, or something went wrong, because you need to dive into the story and get involved and forget about everything and start seeing everything in motion when everything is still, because that's the illusion that you need to build for the reader. He needs to dive in and believe in that illusion. And but once you get behind the curtains, you see how things are done and why they work in certain ways. So but nowadays I think with the internet, and I don't even think like new creators have this the same enthusiasm that I did, with every discovery, because nowadays you have like videos and tons of videos of teaching how to ink or how to draw, or um, I'm from the time that you had to buy like a book, how to draw superheroes, how to ink, how to draw the Marvel style, all these books. You had to find these books and then buy these books and learn from these books. Now you have like hundreds of videos, different videos from an unknown number of artists, and you can learn from them. So I don't think new artists respect and cherish as much every discovery of the craft as they evolve, as they get along, because it's too available, I think, now.
Well, and I think part of it too is like you found out Mike used pens after you'd already been drawing comics and drawing art for a long time. I mean, you and Fabio went to fine arts school too, right? So
Yes.
you studied fine arts, and so you learned about a lot of different types of art. You were well down the path before you discovered how you could do something differently. And that discovery changed things, but you already kind of developed your voice yourself. And like, I do think sometimes that's part of the thing that makes, I think information accessibility is good, but I do wonder if sometimes it might homogenize stuff to some degree, if that makes sense, where it like kind of, it's, if everyone's inking the right way, is everyone inking the same way? Does that make sense? It's like, here's a random example. I'm a big basketball fan. Like Michael Jordan shoots the way you should shoot a basketball, but it's not the only way you should shoot a basketball. And I think sometimes the differences are what make things special.
Yeah. If you take that basketball metaphor further, I think there's a difference between learning how to play by like training and going to a basketball school or something and learning the basics and the shape of the shot or everything and the mechanics. And on the other hand, you have people that see this like short reels on Instagram or whatever they're called, of all the shots that are getting made on yesterday's game, or only highlights, and trying to replicate that
Right.
only by looking at it. So there are differences, how to get there and how that shot is different from just a regular shot, or how difficult it is. And I think, I don't know if that really, I know that has changed a lot, and I'm on board with you that information is great and information accessibility is great. I wouldn't be working on the US market if there was not for the internet, because I always exchange emails with editors and artists, and I never had to send artwork by mail. I always scan my pages and send it online. So, and I know artists in the 90s that used to have to send FedEx all the pages for the publishers, and I never had to do that. But there are some things that you can only learn by doing it. And like, for example, nowadays a lot of people draw digitally, right? It has evolved a lot. There are different programs, different apps, different, let's call it, hardware. So you can draw on a Cintiq, or you can draw on an iPad or similar stuff, and different programs for each one. And the ones people one likes more or the other and stuff. And all these tools inside of it. So it definitely made it easier to ink your comic in a slightly more professional way. Because if you're a 16-year-old kid who believes that he needs to ink with a brush and Indian ink on paper, this kid would suffer to get to a point where he is good at it. But digitally, this suffering is a little smaller, and he can get a slightly better result, almost professional result, easier. But I think in the end, he understands it less. And I think that's one of the downsides, I think, of every part of the digital creation nowadays. The digital tools, they made everything easier, which is great. But in the end, only the ones that go really deep into researching it, they understand what they're doing. The same way someone who had to learn it by hand on physical materials, paper, ink, paint, and whatever. So
one thing I think of a lot when it comes to inking is I've heard a number of artists say things like, or I've talked to artists who have said things like, you learn a lot from the mistakes when you're using physical ink, where it's like, and also sometimes I think it was Michael Lark. I've referenced this way too many times. It was a long time ago when he said this, but sometimes when you're inking, you have happy accidents that are better than anything you could have planned for. And that is one of the things you kind of lose is like, I think with digital, I think sometimes you can chase perfection when sometimes the best result is imperfect.
Yeah. Yeah. Like the whole undo thing, it's the infinite undo thing.
It's a trap.
It's a trap. Yes, it's a trap. And you learn more about yourself when you have to accept your limitations and, how thin can you make that line? How many details can you make? Or, is it going to be straight or slightly bent? And, that's what makes it look like it's made by a human, or what makes it look it was made by you. And it's too many handicaps, I think, working digitally. It's not bad. I'm not saying it's bad. I think it's important, and it's it has come. It's not coming. It has come. I love when I see something that I can't tell it's digital, and because that's the way to do it. You know.
It should feel like it comes from a person.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just a few more questions. I did want to ask, I'm sure you've changed a lot since the days of Apocalypse Suite for Umbrella Academy. That was 2007, I think. Plan B is 18 years later. Do you try to stay consistent with the style you established for Umbrella Academy originally, or do you find yourself kind of tweaking things slightly from series to series still?
I try to be consistent as much as I can, just because it's the same universe, and like readers now, they can get all the books at once and read it at once. And if you change it that much, they won't understand where that came from. And I always believe that it doesn't really matter how long it takes for you to make that comic, because when it's done, it's done. And what matters is it's what's in the page, and people will read it, and people are discovering the Umbrella Academy now, and stuff that was done 20 years ago. And so they need to get a new book and recognize the same stuff, the same characters. And so I try to keep it as similar as I can. But I've changed. I've evolved as an artist. I there are things that I like more or less, and there are definitely changes. I think my artwork's a little bit loosen uh, now than it was 20 years ago. But I try to keep it consistent, because it's the same thing. It needs to be the same thing.
Well, and also, I mean, you mentioned the show a little bit earlier, like with Plan B, which, I should note is the Dark Horse miniseries that launches on June 11th that has you as the artist and co-writer, your co-writer, Gerard Way, colorist Dave Stewart, and letterer Nate Picos. The thing that's interesting about it is that it's the first miniseries that has come out since the show started, I believe. And that is like one thing I really liked about the first issue was that it does a really good job of laying out a simplified version of what readers need to know to jump into the story. And it kind of felt like you and Gerard aimed to make the first issue of Plan B a bit more accessible, perhaps because there would be some people who are like, this is my first time getting into this. Was that the case at all?
I think that the first issue has a similar vibe as the first issue of Apocalypse Suite. I don't think we thought about it intentionally for new readers who are coming into it, but just as a way to make this parallel, like when we first introduced the Umbrella Academy and now we're introducing the Sparrow Academy. So we wanted that kind of feeling that here are all these characters, but in a way that you're already into the story, full speed. And so, but we can't fight this whole new readership that we have. and the feeling that they will get reading the comics for the first time and reading a new comic book that will bring stuff that they kind of have seen because it will be different, but they're, kind of expecting it in a way. They're expecting it the same way, the opposite way as they did when the TV series first started. Like they had the comic book and they compared to the TV series. Now they have a lot of stuff in the TV series that they want to compare. They're expecting it to happen or stuff like that. And it's nice to play with that. But also to remind them, look, this is what we do. And there's a reason why.
Yeah. I mean, you're not adapting the TV show, you're telling a comic story.
Yeah, definitely not. Yes.
Last question with Umbrella Academy. In another interview you did, you described returning to the world of Umbrella Academy as a joy. I am curious as to what makes it such a joy for you, because earlier when you were talking about it, you said it was easy, like it just added up for you. What makes it such a joy for you, both as a storyteller and just as a fan of stories?
Oh, I think it's a lot of fun working on Umbrella Academy because of this superhero genre. So it's a very dynamic story. At the same time, it's a melting pot of different influences and different visual references. So it's very fun to draw and to create stuff to draw for this story. And even though I said earlier that I don't really like working with the same characters all over again, I know and I'm experiencing the joy of returning to a character that you once worked with. So, because you don't have to introduce him or her, introduce them again anymore. You just have to, play new cards for them because they have a history that comes with them. And that's the fun part of telling such a long story and coming back with for these characters, because we're moving forward, we're building up on each one of their stories, on this big story, which is something that I like to do, and I think it's not done so often on the superhero comics, because every once in a while you reset everything because the superheroes needs their core needs to stay the same, and once they get into a point, you either change them or you reboot. And our characters need to change to get along, to evolve, to grow up, so. And that's the fun part of working on these new stories, because I think that up to this point we just threw stuff at them, see how they reacted, see how they would act their part. But now we're really developing them more to get them to where we want, to where we need them to be, to get to the end of the story.
I think it kind of sounds like, in a lot of ways, like you grew up on superheroes. It was something that you were passionate about when you were younger. And like in a lot of ways, it seems like Umbrella Academy is like the answer to the question of what is a superhero story from me? Like it's reflective of you and kind of your desires as a storyteller.
Yeah, a little bit. It's more like what's a superhero comic book for Gerard, but I bought his vision.
Yeah.
I really like it, and it resonates with me, because it's a story about family, and so everyone has one,
Yeah.
and with all the goods and bads and ups and downs, and that's the great thing about this comic, and playing with it into this superhero genre. It's a great way to do it, and that's why I love working on this comic book, because of that element. Yeah.
Last question for you. You've been doing this for a long time. You've been, I mentioned earlier, you started with zines and self-published comics I think it was 1993, so like 32-ish years now. You've gone through a lot. You talked about how like the last 6 years have been a time of change for you and a time of change for the world. It's easy to get burned out, but at the same time, it seems like you still love making comics. You still love making art. What keeps you excited about art and comics?
I love the medium. I love, the format of storytelling that comics can provide, not only for the artist, but also for the reader. I think it's a reading experience that transcends reading a book because it has images working alongside with the book with the words. It's not an illustrated book. Now that I have kids, I read a lot of illustrated books. And I think it works closer to the reader than a movie does, because you as a reader set the pace of the story. You move back and forward, you turn the page, you have that kind of involvement into the story on a comic book. And it's it's underrated, the power of connection that you can get with the reader with this combination of words and images. So I love the medium, and I just work on projects that I love, that I want to exist. For example, Umbrella Academy. We could have just, taken our own ways, do our own things, and not do a new Umbrella Academy comic. But we want this story to exist. We want to tell these stories. We want to go through with it. And I've only worked on projects that I really believe in, because let's face it, like I've been working on this for 5, 6 years. I need to love the story as much to want it to exist
Mm-hmm.
in order to get into it in the first place. So I only get into projects that I believe in, and that, from one sentence I can visualize that's worth it. That's worth going into this journey. And comics have always been there. That, for me, from the first story, even when I didn't really know what were the stories that I wanted to tell, once I got one idea, I grabbed it and I tried to make that real, make that, be real. And I just, I'm just lucky enough to be able to take the time to tell these stories, because, most of people don't have that luxury of, staying on a project 6 years. They need to pay the bills with, whatever comes, whatever shows. And I've been lucky enough to get into good projects that, survive. So, so, so I can just, focus on telling the story the best way I can. But it's not easy. It's hard, because the production speed, you are the first reader of your story. And if you produce new pages constantly, you're seeing the story develop in front of your eyes, literally. And that also is a big incentive, is a big flame that keeps that fire burning, seeing the story developing, getting, alive. And for the past 6 years, and the first years of the pandemic, it was very hard because, my mind was somewhere else, and I wouldn't draw anything for weeks or months. And, it's very hard to keep that flame, lit. And, but now that, I'm drawing, stories are moving forward, it's easier to remind myself why I love this and that it's worth it, and doesn't matter how long it takes in the end.
Well, I'm glad that you're getting the reminder, and every reader is getting a reminder of why they love your stuff, because the first issue is great. But that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about the Umbrella Academy, your career, and everything else. I really appreciate you taking the time.
No, thank you for having me. It's great. I sound a little, grumpy at times, but I can't really fight it. Even though I really love comics, it's not easy. It's worth it. Totally worth it. New kids, if you love comics, go for it. It's just not going to be easy, but I love it.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with cartoonist Gabriel Bá. You can find his work in the upcoming The Umbrella Academy Plan B. As per usual, big thanks to Deanna Chapman for editing this week's episode. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel, and when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my Eisner Award nominated subscription comic site Sketch at sketch.com for long form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content. You can find Off Panel and Sketch on social media by following on Blue Sky and Instagram or following me on Blue Sky and Instagram. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Omega Slice, Luis Felipe Alves, John Walsh, Brandon Paul, Aaron Bussey, AC, Simon Birch, Austin, Scion, Megan Marsden, T.S. Luther, Comic Book Couples Counseling Podcast, Scott Carpenter, Gus, Menkei Freigeist, Saunter, Brian, Chris Robinson, David Byrne, Milton Lawson, Benjamin Wilkins, Chris Hacker, John Neesmith, John Auerbach, Dustin Weaver, Brandon Heyman, Aiden Hammond, Faith Aaron Hicks, Ben Rowe, Cameron Brown, Jonathan Breen, Charlie Stickney, Tom Drennan, Jeremy Thomas Burke, Jared Schwab, Scott Dunn, Chip Mosher, Seth Pomeroy, James McEwen, Andrew Lehman, Christina Merkler, Scott Place, Travis Gibb, Darcy Van Polgees, Tom Evans, Reed Beeman, Kelly Sudaconic, Max Wood, Jeremy Lambert, Brian, Near Levy, Jason Hussa, Kieran Gillen, Jonathan Kent Eurotam, Henry Johnston, Dennis Hoffman, Jingo Broren, James Tynan IV, Chris Langford, Jason Wood, Tom Peachy, Ben Domstead, Rob V, Nick Walker, Patrick Coyle, Isaac Oren, Klaus Vandeven, Subben Industries, Jack Mulqueen, Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Canadian by Proxy, Bradley Rader, Carl Troy, Brandon Pills, Patrick Brower, Declan Shelby, Dan Garino, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, Liana Kingus, Nick Bennett, Susanna Pola, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, Robert Wilson IV, Andrew Carita, Stefan Holt, Philip Myra, Chris Pachala, Torrin Grunbeck, Buzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Walt's Comics and Books, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwan, Vita Ayala, Akil, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, David Kelly, Jason Massey, Adam Bogert, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Brawley, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendrick, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Adam Heifel, Fiona Staples, Mark Abnett, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim DeMonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Wolfpack for letting me use their song Outro as the show's opening theme, and to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out both their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.